Okay, let's finish our notes. Sorry we didn't get to finish them in class, and I'll try to make this efficient, but still helping you understand what you need to know. So, we were talking about all the different things that make something living. So, we have characteristics of life that we need to identify. And on this front page, there are four, and there'll be more on the back side. So, we talked first about the fact that all living things have to obtain energy, and they can be either autotrophs or heterotrophs. Autotrophs make their own food, like plants. Heterotrophs obtain their food from the environment. Okay, all living things are made up of cells. Organisms can be made up of one cell or multiple cells. So we call things that are made up of one cell, we call them unicellular, and if they're made up of two or more cells, then they are multicellular. So let's fill that in. So unicellular, organisms with just one cell. An example of this would be bacteria. Okay, multicellular organisms are organisms made up of more than one cell. The multi is many, uni is one. So multicellular are organisms made up of more than one cell. An example here, since we're talking about a frog or a tadpole in this picture, we'll do frog or a pea plant or humans, animals. Those are all multicellular. We also have a special instance of something called a colonial organism. A colonial organism is a colony of smaller, close to identical individuals that function together like a multicellular organism. An example of that would be a Volvox. I encourage you, if you get a minute, to go and Google Volvox. And actually, I might link it into Google Classroom. There's a video of a Volvox, and it's really cool. It's a colonial organism, meaning it's made up of a bunch of smaller cells that act like a multicellular organism, but it's really individual cells are the organisms. Okay, moving down here to the bottom. In order to be alive, the individual must grow and develop. Okay, so it must grow and develop. Let's see. Sorry, I'm moving my screen here. So cells within the organism take in nutrients and get bigger, but most growth happens through cell division to produce more cells. So growth is, sometimes the cell gets bigger, but most of the time growth is in reference to cells dividing, more and more cells dividing and becoming a bigger organism. And then development is organisms can change form in their development into adulthood as the cells differentiate. Okay, so we know that an organism to be alive has to use energy. It has to be composed of cells. It needs to grow and develop. It also needs to be able to reproduce. And there are types of reproduction that we will see in nature. Organisms reproduce to create new organisms. We have sexual reproduction, which is the production of new organisms from the genetic information of two different individual parents. An example of this, again, is our frog or animals. Those are sexual reproduction. Plants reproduce by sexual reproduction, but then we have asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction, this A means not, we'll learn that later, it means that they're not sexual, that they do not need another individual in order to create a new organism. So this is the production of new living organisms that inherit genetic information from only one parent. An example of this would be bacteria. Bacteria can divide without two parents. It's just the original cell dividing, and that is the creation of new individual organisms. All right, flip it over. Let's keep going. So, what else does an individual have to be in order to be considered alive? Organisms have to be organized or have regulated insides. That means that they have to, that's what this circle is, they have to have internal regulation and order. Okay, internal regulation and order. So inside the cells, sorry, moving my page again. Inside the cells, you have different parts of the cell which we call cell parts organelles, kind of like the inside of us, we call organs. These are organelles, the organs of the cell. Okay, so organelles perform different functions. Inside organisms, cells and tissues and organs then all perform different functions. So the way that inside cells you have organelles that perform different functions for the cell. Inside an organism, you have cells, tissues, and organs that perform different functions. And then these organisms are able to maintain conditions inside their organs, organ systems, and cells, adjusting for external effects. They maintain an internal balance called homeostasis. Example of this is being able to maintain body temperature. Think about it. We're outside, it's 100 degrees outside, and our internal body temperature is always sitting around 98-ish degrees unless you are sick and running a fever. But for the most part, your body is maintaining its internal temperature. Okay? Then, living things respond to the environment. So when something happens outside of them, they respond. So this is when living things respond to stimuli in their environment. Stimuli or stimulus. A stimulus is one, stimuli is multiple, but it's when an organism has something affect it and they respond to it. So examples of this are changes in temperature, light, sound, chemical composition of the surroundings, and humidity or moisture levels, humidity or moisture levels, and even touch or contact. There are some plants that respond to touch. If you touch them, their leaves will retract. So that's responding to stimuli. Okay, and then the last one. So scientists feel like in order for something to be considered alive, it needs to evolve or adapt. Creation-wise, as far as we're concerned, adaptation is not something that scientists argue, even creationists even argue. We know that organisms adapt. The evolutionary process has to do with the fact that people who believe in evolution believe that new species evolve from an earlier species, and that's where the main differentiation takes place. So we're not arguing that point with this. We're just talking about how there is adaptation happening among organisms over time. So populations of organisms change over time. That doesn't really fit in there, does it? Okay, change over time to adapt to their environment. Characteristics that help them live and reproduce are passed to offspring. This is still true. This is not something that's debated. But then the process of natural selection is where we begin to differ, because again, natural selection is what scientists would say leads to speciation, where one species becomes a different species. But the adaptation part is true. Okay, so those are your 7 different living traits, the characteristics of life. There are 7 of them. We want to make one more comment to talk about viruses, because a lot of time people get confused and think viruses are alive. And in fact, viruses are not alive. So let's prove that to be true. Are viruses alive? So let's go through the questions or the 7 different characteristics of life and give that answer. So cells, first of all, are viruses made of cells? Right off the bat, viruses are not made of cells. They are like molecular machines that invade host cells. So they don't need to be made up of cells, because they invade a host cell and use that. And they use that host cell's machinery to reproduce more, quote unquote, machines. So viruses are not made up of cells. Do they use energy? Well, they do not eat or obtain energy on their own. When they're in the host cell does, but they don't. So we already have strike 2. No cells, and they don't obtain energy. Do they respond to the environment? Well, they do not sense the way that normal cells do, so we will say no there. Do they grow and develop? Well, they do reproduce to a degree, but they don't grow. Once a virus is made, it is what it is. So they do not grow or develop. They are built. Okay? They, for reproduction, they do reproduce to a degree. They are basically copied. It's like making photocopies. They are copied by the host cell. What about internal regulation and order? They do have specific simple structures, but they do not have homeostasis. Oops, spelled that wrong. Homeostasis. They don't regulate internally. And lastly, the evolution. Viruses actually do kind of go through an evolution process, except I wrote evolve, that's a V, E. Okay, they kind of evolve because their genetic code can change, and therefore they can then kind of do different things the next time around that they go invade a different host. But again, they're not really ever alive, so it's not the same thing. There's no species changing. And so if as the host cell makes a mistake in copying, the virus's genetic code then can change. Okay? All right. That is page 1. Let's go to page 2. This is the organization levels of life. So switch your pages. I'll let you take 1 second to do that while I do the same thing. I'm going to change colors of pens too because I get tired of looking at the same color. How about green? Okay, so this is a cell, okay? This is a eukaryotic cell. We'll talk more about eukaryotic and prokaryotic in a minute. But a eukaryotic cell is a cell that has a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So these are all our cells. All our cells are eukaryotic. So make sure I'm still on the screen. Oh, no, you can't see what I wrote. Okay, so we're up here in the top corner. This cell right here is a typically considered like an animal cell, but it's eukaryotic. It means that it has a nucleus and it has membrane-bound organelles. So it's made of lots of organelles and other cell parts. Okay? So then we're looking here at this cell. What's an organelle? An organelle is part of the cell. Remember, it's the organ of the cell. So this particular one is a mitochondria, or mitochondrion is singular. Mitochondrion. And it's made of lots of larger molecules. All right, let's stop for just 2 seconds. And I want you to go down here to the bottom right of the page, because this would have been better for me to start down here. So when we're starting at the very, 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 very basic organizational levels, we want to start with an atom. So an atom is like an atom of carbon, or an atom of gold, or an atom of silver. If you think of atoms, it's all the different things on the periodic table. So we'll do carbon here because since we're talking about life, all life is built from carbon atoms. And so atoms are made of subatomic particles. Electrons, protons, neutrons. Electrons are outside the nucleus, protons are in the nucleus, neutrons are in the nucleus. All right, so you take a bunch of atoms and you put them together. And when you take a bunch of atoms and you put them together, you get a larger molecule, or a macromolecule, as we like to call them in science. An example of this is DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, abbreviated capital D, capital N, capital A, DNA. And this large molecule is made up of a bunch of small atoms put together. Plural, atoms. Okay? Now, macromolecules make up a bunch of things. They make up viruses. So this is an example of a bacteriophage, which is made up of large molecules, these macromolecules. You also have this over here is a prokaryotic cell. These prokaryotic cells, like bacteria. So let me move that. Bacteria, or a bacterial cell. You can write that, bacterial cell. These are made up of lots of large molecules. But these prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic cells. Okay, now when you take these macromolecules and you put a bunch of them together, that's when you make organelles. And then when you take a bunch of organelles and you put them together, you make a eukaryotic cell. Okay, so you're essentially starting down here with the atom, building macromolecules, building organelles, and then building a cell. Then what? You have a cell. Is that all we are? Is one cell? No, of course not. We are lots of cells. So let's flip to the back. And see this little line right here? This little line essentially connects back to this line here coming off of the eukaryotic cell. Okay? So now we take a bunch of cells and we put them together, and this is then called a tissue. So an example of this would be the stomach lining tissue. And any kind of tissue is a group of cells of the same type. So you take a bunch of cells that are the same type of cell, you put them together, and it forms that tissue. Now, if you take a bunch of tissues that are all the same type, it builds an organ. An organ example would be the stomach. It's made of several types of tissues, and they function in a specific way. The stomach has a specific job. The stomach doesn't do the brain's job. The brain doesn't do the liver's job. They all have their own job. Okay, next is you take a bunch of organs and you put them together to complete a certain task, and it forms an organ system. Example of this is the digestive system. And this is made up of several types of organs. So the digestive system is the stomach, and it's got the gallbladder and the liver, and it's got the small intestine and the large intestine. And they all go together, and that's the digestive system. Okay, now when you put a bunch of when you put a bunch of organ systems together, you get an organism, like a human, like us. And these are made of several organ systems. Then you take the organism and you put them together with a lot of other of the same organism, and you get a population. Now, it's all got to be a bunch of humans together is a human population. This is a group of organisms of the same species. That live in the same area. Okay? Then you take a bunch of these populations, and you got population of humans, you got a population of cats, you got a population of apple trees, and now you have a community. A community is a group of populations of different species. That share the same habitats. They're all living in the same part. That's like all the people living in Flowery Branch. There's the population of humans, the population of oak trees, the population of cardinals, the population of all different stuff. It forms our community. And then when you take a bunch of communities and they're in the same region, you get an ecosystem. So an example of this would be the rainforest ecosystem. Okay, all of the organisms and abiotic factors. Abiotic means non-living factors. So that examples of that is the weather, the water, the land conditions in that specific area make up the ecosystem. And then you have a biome. The biome would be the rainforest biome. Which is a group of ecosystems that cover a large area of the biosphere, and biosphere is the Earth. All right, those are your notes. They will help you to do today's homework. There are 2 pages, one that corresponds to the characteristics of life and one that corresponds to the organization of life. Okay, talk to you guys on Friday.